Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to discuss about repository annotation from Spring Boot. It's a part of component scanning and bean definition category. We have 7 categories as I explained before. In this category we have component annotation, service annotation, repository annotation, controller, REST controller, bean annotation. And today we are going to talk about repository annotation. Before that, we should know MVC design pattern. So usually when the user think about is a web-based application, user access google.com and we will be displayed with the HTML, Google homepage. User enters some search and it will pull the data from the database and display to the page, result page, again HTML. So view can be HTML, JSP or maybe other type of front end. So user request, we will get a view and we enter something and that data will be passed to the controller and it has some business logic. It will connect to the database, various stuffs through model and pull the data from the database and model will be created and came back to controller. Controller will again display the data in the view. If you see, as the request goes through, it will come back through the same way. It's like a highway, go one direction, come similarly same direction in the back. If you look at deep down into controller and model and database, usually we see something similar like controller tier, service tier, persistence tier, database. So we get a request from front end, controller will take that request and it will give you the value to the service and service will deal with the persistent layer. The persistent layer, so we'll be having repository details like a repository interfaces in Spring and entities and application properties. There we get to know which table we are going to handle and which tab we are going to hit and get the data, the configuration of the table and connection pooling, blah 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 other stuff. So here in the persistence layer, the repository annotation coming into the picture. And you see this repository, it act between service layer and database layer. In service layer will give a request to repository, persistent layer. So this layer, then the repository interface, it will use entity. Entity is nothing but I would say is entity class, bean class in Java. We'll deal with the database and get the data. Let's look at repository annotation. It's one of the annotation from Spring Boot and is an extension of component annotation. I would say repository annotation equal to component plus additional features. So it indicates that it will deal with the persistent layer. In the persistent layer, we will be using this annotation to talk to the database and give the response to the service. And mostly we use this for handling database transactions, D2O, DO stuff, and it's a stereotype annotation. If you look at features of this annotation, as I said, is an extension of component, and in this repository annotation, we'll be having some more exceptions which are top of the existing database related exceptions from Java. And as I said, it's mostly deal with DAO, D2O design patterns, means it will access the database and transfer the data to the database. Let's look at repository interfaces. The repository interface is a marker interface. It has two childs, CRUDRepository, JPARepository. As I said, repository interface is a marker interface. It has no methods. And this CRUDRepository is a sub interface for repository interface. The CRUD itself says create, read, update, delete. You can create a table, read the rows, update the rows, delete the table and rows. So it has these CRUD operation methods. If you look at this particular PPT, like count, delete all, find all, save. So basically, you can act upon object for the basic operations. We have one more interface that's called JPARepository Interface. It's an extension of paging, query by example executor, and paging and sorting is the extension of CRUD repository. So CRUD repository has the basic operations methods, and JPA has sorting and paging additional. If you want to pull the data and make it sortable, you can use JPA repository. Let's look at repository interfaces. The repository interface is a marker interface. It has two childs: CRUD repository, JPA repository. As I said, repository interface is a marker interface. It has no methods. And this CRUD repository is a sub interface for repository interface. The CRUD itself says create, read, update, delete. You can create a table, read the rows, update the rows, delete the table and rows. So it has these CRUD operation methods. If you look at this particular PPT, like count, delete all, find all, save. So basically, you can act upon object for the basic operations. We have one more interface that's called JPARepository Interface. It's an extension of paging, query by example executor, and paging and sorting is the extension of CRUD repository. So CRUD repository has the basic operations methods, and JPA has sorting and paging additional. If you want to pull the data and make it sortable, you can use JPA repository. So this is the syntax of how to use repository annotation. I have created an interface called user repository, and it extends JPA repository. I can extend JPA or CRUD repository because I want to have rows with sorting and paging support. So that's the reason I went ahead with the JPA repository. And you see in the bracket user comma log, user is an entity class, means this user is a class having an entity annotation that is correspondence of user table in the database. And there's another parameter log means the primary key column user id is a log type. If you say the primary key column is int, means you should say int. So this is syntax. This is the example. At that repository interface, user repository extend JPA. Again I say user and log. Let's look at configuration file. In the Spring we can have application.properties or YAML file for defining properties for the project. So here I'm defining a data source for a database. You would see the database icon in the left side at row 1, means it's dealing with the database. So these details can be vary depending on the database. For Oracle, the URL driver class will be different, user and password and all the stuff. MySQL will be different. So you know where is the database, what is the username and password. So when you have those details, you need to fill it up here. Means the repository, when we're creating annotation, the interface, we are linking the entity class, means table, on which table, this is the database. So it's coming other way. So we are telling that, hey Spring, so here are the database details, create tables, update the tables, update the rows. So these details can be different for different databases. And one more thing I would like to highlight, when we say public interface user repository, we are defining interface extension of a JPA repository. But when you run the Spring, based on this property file details, it's going to create steps, proxy classes for the implementation for our user repository. We are not going to implement these interfaces. Spring Boot, it's going to implement classes for us, where it will create how to create a connection, the properties file, transaction manager, everything Spring takes care of us. That's a good thing about Spring Boot. It will create proxy classes for us, which means less boilerplate code. Simply we need to worry about the designing a table and interface. And we are extending JPA, means we have few functionalities are available which Spring Boot is going to create those implementations. Let me create a project for us for repository interface. com.example dot repository should be var file, Java 17 is okay, Maven, Spring Boot version 3.40, and I would say JPA. This is the starter, and I will be connecting with MySQL. Let's generate the project. Say okay. Yeah, this is the project that we have created. I just imported. So application properties has no details. This is a basic application. Let's run this guy if we have any issues or not. Let's see. This looks good. Running at 8080 port. Let's add property for the database connection. Now create a repository annotation, interface, user repository extends JPA. Okay, user class is missing. Let's create a user class. This should be the entity. I will make user ID as primary key. So okay, if I run this application, it's going to what happen? Okay, it should be interface. So if I run this application, so this user repository is extend JPI. It's going to create a user table, and this is the primary key column. This is like another field or column. We are not inserting any rows here. And in this example, we are using H2 database. If you look at here, I just deleted that table, user not form. If you look at here, there is no user table. So let me run this guy. See, Hibernate drop table if exist, and Hibernate create table user ID not null, and name is a var string, and primary key column is user ID. So this is the primary key column ID, user ID. Let's go here. See, users created.